Good afternoon. I'm Marianne Mason, Dean of the Graduate Division, and it gives me my great pleasure to welcome you today, many familiar faces here, to the annual Howison Lectures in Philosophy, and to welcome our speaker this year, David Kaplan. As a condition of the bequest of Professor Howison, we're obliged to tell you how the endowment series supporting the lectures came to UC Berkeley. George Holmes Howison was born in 1834 in Ohio. Young George attended all-boys Marietta Academy and later Marietta College, where he developed a passion for literature and mathematics and received his first taste of philosophy. Following college, he moved to St. Louis, which was immediately after the Civil War, and as a member of the St. Louis Philosophical Society's Kant Club, Howison had the opportunity to meet with the influential thinkers of his time, figures such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Amos Bronson Alcott, and William James. In 1884, after a 6-year professorship at the MIT, Howison saw the light and accepted an offer from the University of California to establish a department of philosophy. This included his appointment as Mills Professor of Intellectual and Moral Philosophy and Civil Polity. In this position, he occupied the university's first endowed chair. With a strong, outgoing personality, he made philosophy a factor not only in the university but in the surrounding community. Howison took a great interest in his students and was greatly involved in their lives. He taught at the university until 1919, and Mr. Howison died in Berkeley at the age of 81. He gave all of his property to the university and thus created several foundations, including one for a graduate fellowship in philosophy. Bless his heart. In 1919, friends and former students established the Howison Lectures in Philosophy at the University of California in honor of an eminent scholar. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Alan Code, who's the chair of the Howison Committee, to the podium to introduce our speaker, David Kaplan. Mr. Code.
Hello. Well, we're extremely fortunate to have as our Howison lecturer this year, Professor David Kaplan of the UCLA Philosophy Department. Having been educated, you were, right? Yeah, having been educated at UCLA, he subsequently has taught there for his entire career, and for the last decade has been the Hans Reichenbach Professor of Scientific Philosophy. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has been president of the Western Division of the American Philosophical Association, and vice president of the Association of Symbolic Logic. He's also the editor for several scholarly journals, including the Journal of Philosophical Logic, and Studies in Logic and Foundations of Mathematics. In addition, 4 years ago, UCLA Today honored him as Teacher of the Century. Now, that was in 2000, and so there's still some debate about which century. Were they looking forward or backwards? But I think you deserve it for the next century. But his contributions in philosophy of language and logic have greatly enhanced the critical understanding of the legacies of both Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell in the area of semantics, and his own ideas on the character and content of statements, on direct reference and singular propositions, on demonstratives, and on intentionality and opacity have had a fundamental impact on the development of contemporary Anglo-American philosophy. He has taught us to ask who can say what, and to look at the limits of language by asking what we cannot do with words. What more should I tell you? I could mention his influential and seminal publications, How to Rustle a Frege Church, for example. I could say more about how exciting his ongoing research project is, but his mere presence here demonstrates so vividly the vitality of his personality. At this point, I should simply say it's my great privilege to introduce to you Professor David Kaplan, who will now speak to you on the meaning of ouch and oops. Professor Kaplan.
I'm very honored to be here. You could see the respect. I'm wearing the suit. It's a display of respect. I'm going to talk about displays of respect. Unfortunately, displays of respect aren't always sincere. We'll come to that later, but this one is. I actually looked at this long list of distinguished Howison lecturers, and I found it very reassuring. With the quality of the Howison Lecture so firmly established over such a long period of time, my own performance can't really do very much to lower the average. This paper that I'm going to try to zoom through is a bit of a ride. It's a long and kind of complicated paper, and I've tried to chop it down to get it into something like a little bit over an hour, and I hope I'll be able to do that by reading fast. It addresses audiences of different levels of sophistication, none quite adequately, and it pretty much rides roughshod over nuance. So it's more of a George Bush paper than a John Kerry paper in that respect. But I hope that I can break open some new ground. So here we go. So this is the kind of outline of the topics. Prologue, logic, validity, truth, logic, deviance, ouch, oops, non-translational meta-language, eliminability, which may have to be eliminated, goodbye, and then some conclusions. There are words that have a meaning, or at least for which we can give their meaning, words like fortnight and feral. There are also words that don't seem to have a meaning, words like goodbye and the first person pronoun I. If the latter have a meaning, they're at least hard to define. Still, they have a use, and those who know English know how to use them. In fact, I venture to say that all English speakers know how to use goodbye and the first person pronoun I, whereas relatively few could define fortnight and feral. Within philosophy, and especially 20th century philosophy, there are two great traditions of semantic theory. One, a formalist tradition in which the great figures are all logicians. Well, I hope you'll excuse me. I'm just going to kind of put my head down and just read my way through instead of allowing you to gaze on my smiling countenance. There's a formalist tradition in which the great figures are all logicians, Frege, Russell, Tarski, Carnap, Church, and Kripke, and the other, an anti-formalist tradition in which the great figures are Wittgenstein, Strawson, Austin, and Grice. Berkeley's own Donald Davidson is actually in the formalist tradition, although he wasn't a formalist himself. The formalists, for the most part, studied the idealized languages of science. The anti-formalists studied natural language, especially its context sensitivity. It's from Wittgenstein that the slogan, meaning is use, is derived. I was trained by Carnap, Church, and Montague and came to believe that the slogan, meaning is use, was simply a cop-out to keep the study of language humanistic and to avoid the rigors of logical theory. Now, this was a foolish and naive view, but I was a graduate student. It's no offense to graduate students. The slogan, meaning is use, was a theme of Strawson's 1950 classic On Referring. Strawson argues that the primary bearers of reference and truth are not expressions, but uses of them. And Strawson closes that famous article with the following sentence. He says, neither Aristotelian nor Russellian rules give the exact logic of any expression of ordinary language, for ordinary language has no exact logic. So there's a lot of logician bashing in this kind of movement. Strawson's article reflected a widespread view that the methods of logic were by their nature only suitable to a highly regimented, unadorned core of language, a core that is perhaps adequate to mathematics and parts of science, but that is hopelessly remote from the subtle riches of natural language. Strawson thought that where meaning is use, it lies beyond logic's domain. Now, this is the obverse of the foolish and naive view that I held as a graduate student, but it's equally foolish and naive. The most prominent logician of the time encouraged this view for his own reasons. When I asked Strawson, I used to live across the street from Strawson. When I asked Strawson why he thought that there could be no logic for a language with indexicals, he said it was because W.V.L. Quine had told him so. Thus there was formed a strange alliance, Quine, a famous logician. Thus there was formed a strange alliance between those who disdained the regimented language and those who preferred it. The point of agreement was the gulf between logic's domain and natural language. The alliance was sustained by the notion that in natural language, meaning is determined by use. Strawson asked, in effect, how could the lumbering formalist capture the context-sensitive, intention-driven quicksilver of individual use? And the logician replied, why would we want to? In a paper of mine from the early 70s, I tried to show that by adding context as a parameter, Strawson's conventions for referring, as he calls them, even if neglected by logicians, could be accommodated within the range of our methods. And at the time, I regarded my work as extending current semantical methods just to the degree necessary to incorporate the indexicals. Indexicals are words that change reference depending on when and where and who uses them. Words like I, now, here, today, tomorrow, and so on. When different people use these words at different times, they refer to different things, so we call those indexicals. I won't say why we call them indexicals. I regarded what I was doing by adding the indexicals as a sort of epicycle on Carnap's method of extension and intension, and I didn't think of it as involving any different conception of semantics or what semantics was supposed to do. Some years ago, it occurred to me that the analysis of indexicals in demonstrative could be seen as the scientific realization of a Strawsonian semantics of use. Ask not after otherworldly meanings, ask only after rules of use. Now, this led me to explore the differences between what I now call a semantics of meanings with a capital M and a semantics of use. I began to see the semantics of indexicals as having greater affinities with the semantics or potential semantics of epithets, diminutives, interjections, nicknames, ethnic slur terms, and the like, than with the paradigms of meaningfulness, things like fortnight and feral and so on, the language of science. So here's what I'm trying to do. I want to explore the semantics, that is the conventionalized information that's carried by the expressions of our language. I call it semantic information. I want to explore the semantics of a range of expressions whose semantics has been largely ignored by those like myself who work in a formalist tradition. The fact that we have ignored these expressions is probably best explained as flowing from three factors: a combination of, first, disdain. Think of the expressions I'm talking about, diminutives. Little things. A combination of disdain, acceptance of a false theory, namely that these expressions are just kind of stylistic variants of expressions that we can already account for. So, for example, the expression honky, which is a pejorative term for Caucasians, is really just a stylistic variant of the word Caucasian. That was the view. And the third factor was the imagined impossibility of a systematic semantics whose goal is to capture anything other than what's said, what is asserted by a sentence, what is claimed by a sentence. Not that one couldn't say illuminating things about this, but the question is, could one do what I call a systematic semantics, that is a kind of formalistic kind of thing. I now believe that by attending to rules of use, the right sort of rules of use, we can extend our formal semantics and thus even our logic to systematically account for the ignored semantic phenomena, and with surprising and I hope illuminating results. So here's my method. I don't ask what the expression means. For example, I don't ask, what does goodbye mean? Instead, I ask, what are the conditions under which the expression would be correctly or accurately used? This seems a much more fruitful line of inquiry for a word like goodbye. To the degree that such conditions reflect linguistic convention, the information that such a condition obtains is carried in the semantics of the expression. I'm speaking a little bit roughly here, but you'll get lots of examples. Now, note that in the case of indexicals, a similar situation holds. Take, for example, the first-person pronoun I. It seems fruitless to ask what the first-person pronoun means. As Frege said, it seems to mean different things on different occasions of use. But the question, what are the conditions under which the first-person pronoun would be correctly used, quickly yields a good answer, namely, to refer to the person who uses it. And this simple good answer constitutes an adequate basis for a fruitful semantics of indexicals, or so I believe. I'm going to jump over some stuff. I now think that there really isn't any incompatibility between the project of the formalist and the anti-formalist view that for at least certain expressions, meaning is use, or to put it somewhat more exactly, for certain expressions of natural language, a correct semantic theory would state rules of use rather than giving a translation or providing something like a concept or a meaning expressed. Once I recognized that the work I had done in constructing a logic of indexicals could be viewed as a scientific realization of the idea that for indexicals meaning is use, I began to explore the extension of those ideas to a range of other expressions that had seemed, or that I had been taught were, intractable to formal methods. So now I'm going to move to this topic, logic validity, and I'm going to turn first to my most audacious claim. In the earlier work on indexicals, I attempted to show through the use of formal methods that the semantic rules governing indexicals produce a distinctive and deviant pattern of logical consequence. For example, the sentence, "I am here now," may be regarded as a logical truth of a language containing indexicals. True whenever uttered, one might say. But the sentence, "It is necessary that I am here now," would not be true, let alone be a logical truth. I mean, I am here now, as you've all noticed, but it isn't necessary that I be here now. I mean, the taxi could have broken down, the plane could have broken down. I'm in the process of breaking down anyway. I could have broken down a little bit earlier, and so on. Okay. So the familiar modal principle of necessity generalization to derive from the fact that phi is a logical truth, the conclusion that necessarily phi is also a logical truth, seems to fail. I will below try to show the same, that is, that the semantic rules produce a distinctive and deviant pattern of logical consequence for epithets as well as diminutives, interjections, ethnic slur terms, and the like. I will try, that is, to challenge this dictum that logic is immune to epithetical color. This is something epithets, Frege and Carnap would have said. So Frege is the great founder, perhaps of analytic philosophy, but certainly of modern philosophy of language. And he was a teacher of Carnap, and Carnap was my teacher, so I'm his grand student, right? So this is one of those things where you go against your parents, and there's lots to say about it. But I won't go into that side of the issue. So Frege and Carnap would have said that epithets do not contribute to the cognitive content, and thus the study of their use belongs not to semantics, but to pragmatics, something that's more situational and so on. Okay, but I want to show that that's not the case. All right, so I'm going to challenge that. Dictum. Now, this is a more consequential and even controversial project, raising questions not only about the semantics of epithets, but about the very nature of logic. I think it is or should be uncontroversial that expressions of these kinds have a stable conventional meaning, or perhaps better, a stable conventional use. We say hello when we meet, goodbye when we part. One who used these expressions in the opposite way would be making a linguistic error, an error on a par with using fortnight to mean a period of 1 week. Similarly, the word honky is a derogatory term for Caucasians, and anyone who claims to be using it in a non-derogatory sense is also making a linguistic error. The kind of error a person would be making if they said, well, they use the word kitchenette to apply to any kitchen no matter what size it is or where it's located. So the question is not whether there are rules governing the correct use of such expressions. There are. The question is whether such rules which give expressions what I call expressive content can affect logic. By rules, I'm talking about linguistic conventions that are common across the language. Okay, the question is whether it can affect logic. Now, my argument that the stable linguistic conventions under discussion can have consequences for the notion of logical validity turns on some examples. Here's a main example. So I'm going to present you with two arguments. Each has a premise and a conclusion. You have to make a judgment as to whether intuitively these strike you as logically valid arguments. That is, does the conclusion follow from the premise or not? Here's, by the way, if you're very sophisticated about the notion of logical validity, then you have to put all your sophistication aside, because you have to, I mean, logic is not a stipulative subject, right? So you have to go into it on an intuitive basis in terms of how does it strike you, what strikes you as being the correct thing to say. So here's the first argument. The premise is this: that damn Kaplan was promoted. That's the premise. And the conclusion is Kaplan was promoted. Now, this I call argument one. This seems like a logically valid argument to me. Your intuitions may differ from mine, but to me, it seems like a perfectly good argument. The conclusion is a logical consequence of the premise. Now I'm going to give you a second argument. Here's the second argument. The second argument has as premise Kaplan was promoted. And the conclusion is that damn Kaplan was promoted. There's some variance on this. We could make the conclusion, alas, Kaplan was promoted, right? And that would work in the other case too. You could take as premise, alas, Kaplan was promoted, conclusion, Kaplan was promoted, right, and so on. All right. Now, I'm disinclined to accept the second as a valid argument. How does it come about that one of these seems valid and the other one doesn't seem valid? Well, in order to give an analysis of the two arguments, I want to use a little bit of terminology. So a descriptive is an expression which roughly describes something which either is or is not the case. So a normal declarative sentence I think of as a descriptive. Let us call an expression an expressive if it expresses or displays something which either is or is not the case. Now, if what is displayed or expressed is to either be or not be the case, it must have sentential form. And to transform what we intuitively take to be the expressive, in the present case, derogatory content of a term into sentential form sometimes takes a bit of ingenuity. For example, one might intuitively say that the exclamation, ouch, expresses or displays pain. Whereas expresses or displays pain. Okay, I shall say, this is a slight variant on that it displays the fact, if it was a sincere exclamation, it displays the fact that I am in pain, right? So instead of saying that when I say ouch, what's expressed is pain, right? I'm going to say what's expressed is that I am in pain, okay? Now there may be problems here, but let's see where it takes us. This is critical, actually, to the line of development of the project, since once we have expressive content in sentential form, if we can get it into a sentential form, we can bring out our old toolbox and go to work. Now, I say that an expression is descriptively correct if what it describes is the case. And I say that an expression is expressively correct if what it expresses or displays is the case. Now, you need to take account of context for most of the expressives because they often express something about the speaker. Thus, your exclamation, ouch, has a certain expressive content that you are in pain, and it may be expressively correct because you are in pain. Whereas my exclamation, ouch, has a different expressive content, namely that I am in pain, and it may fail to be expressively correct because I'm faking. I don't want you to get all the sympathy for your screaming, ouch, ouch, ouch. I want to share in some of that sympathy. So the content, expressive content is different because one is about you, one is about me. In your case, the utterance was expressively correct because the content held, and in my case, it was not expressively correct. Usually, but subject to exceptions noted below, this is important, the exceptions, expressives display something about a state or attitude of the speaker. One of the notable features of language as a system for conveying information is that you can lie with it. And a correct semantics for expressives must provide for the ability to use expressives in this dishonest way, as in my saying, ouch, when in fact I'm not in pain. I don't know if that's exactly a lie, right? I'm not sure that we would quite use that term there, but there's a kind of dissimulation that's of some form that's taking place. I'll actually talk about what that is in a little bit. So it's important for that reason to separate the semantic information that's associated with the expression, that is what is expressed, the expressive content of it, from the question of whether what is expressed is or is not the case. So we need to know what the content is, and then it's a separate question as to whether it holds or not. Okay. Assuming that the epithet damn is an expressive and that it expresses a derogatory attitude on the part of the speaker, then the sentence, that damn Kaplan was promoted, is going to be expressively correct just in case the speaker has a derogatory attitude toward Kaplan, and descriptively correct just in case Kaplan was promoted. Now, it may be that the epithet does more than express, that is, display or ventilate a certain attitude. It may also belittle, thus carrying a performative role in addition to its expressive role. Because I'm still uncertain as to how this fits together with the semantics, pragmatics, logic, and the other subjects on which I wish to focus, and because I do believe that the performative function is over and above the semantic expressive function, I'll not take up this aspect of derogatory expressions. Now I want to turn to the vexed question of truth. If one were inclined to call a sentence true, if it were merely descriptively correct, independently of its expressive correctness, then one would regard both arguments as being truth-preserving, since the descriptive contents of premise and conclusion are the same. Because I regard argument 1 but not argument 2 as a logically valid argument, I would come to the conclusion that logical validity is not about truth preservation. And that's pretty much is the conclusion that I come to. That it's not about truth preservation, but rather about what I might call information delimitation. I mean, that's an awkward phrase, but I haven't been able to think of a more graceful phrase for it. Information delimitation. And I've written that idea down here. For an argument to be valid, there must be no semantic information in the conclusion that is not already contained in the premises. Now, this gives a necessary, though it doesn't give a sufficient condition. It doesn't claim to give a sufficient condition. There are reasons why this doesn't quite give a sufficient condition. It gets fairly complicated, and I'm not going to go into that, a sufficient condition for logical validity. The medievals called this view of validity the containment theory of logical validity. The idea was that the conclusion is somehow contained in the premises. And some of you who read early logic know that before there was all the talk about truth and truth preservation, that was the original view. I use my notion of semantic information to try to explicate this idea of containment. It's obviously not obvious what it means to say that the conclusion is contained in the premises, although I don't think it means if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true also. Okay, so, now, what I call the vexed question I'm doing that already. Okay, information delimitation. Okay, for me, the problem with argument 2 is that it violates this constraint. Although nothing is said, argument 2, remember, Kaplan was promoted, conclusion, that damn Kaplan, or alas, Kaplan was promoted. Nothing is said in the conclusion, nothing's asserted in the conclusion that is not said or asserted in the premises, but there is an intrusion of information that's expressed or displayed in the conclusion that is not available from the premises. Something that speaks to the attitude of the person who was speaking, which wasn't there in the premise. It isn't the fact that there's expressives involved that make it invalid. You know, that damn Kaplan was promoted, conclusion, that damn Kaplan was promoted. I don't think there's a problem with that, right? Or either that damn Kaplan was promoted or he wasn't, or either that damn Kaplan was promoted or that damn Smith was promoted, right? I don't think there's a problem with those inferences, but there's a problem from Kaplan was promoted to that damn Kaplan was promoted, because somehow, it's not that more is said, but somehow there's more semantic information in the conclusion than in the premises. Okay, now there's an alternative way of talking, this is still on truth, that one might adopt. One might decide to use truth in a broader way, so that in the case of an expression that has both descriptive and expressive elements, we would say that the sentence is true only if it's both descriptively correct and expressively correct. We would then say that the sentence, that damn Kaplan was promoted, when taken as uttered by a particular person, is true in the wider sense, call it true plus, only if Kaplan was promoted and the person who spoke did have a derogatory attitude toward him. If you were to use this notion of truth, sometimes I call it truth with an attitude, then you could say that logical validity is indeed truth preserving, or more precisely, truth plus preserving. Now, there's a terminological question here that doesn't really matter. You could settle it by stipulation, but stipulation doesn't settle the vexed question, and the vexed question is, what's the right notion of truth in a case like this, or is there a correct notion of truth? That means, is there a correct extension of the notion of truth to sentences of the normal, that we have for sentences of the normal kind, to deal with sentences that have these expressive elements in them? So one of the things that I think is important and extremely interesting is that although we may have differing, even shaky intuitions about how to apply the pre-theoretical notion of truth in these cases, we, or at least some of us, have more stable intuitions about logical consequence. That is, the intuition that one of these arguments is valid and the other argument isn't, that in one case the conclusion is a logical consequence of the premise, in the other case it isn't a logical consequence of the premise, that's a much more widely shared intuition than intuitions about when the premises are true and when they're false, and does the expressive content have to be true, and what do you want to say about that? Now, these more stable intuitions about logical consequence have been ignored because of the nearly universal, and according to me fallacious, assumption that the notion of logical consequence is derivative from the more secure notion of truth. as I say, the way history has unrolled, right? The old containment idea was beaten out by the notion of truth preservation. So the modern notion of logical validity is dependent on a prior understanding of truth. Again, the concept of truth, so how does the, let me start again. Okay, so the concept of truth is already problematic as soon as we contemplate any sentence where the semantics associates more than one content with it. Here it's interesting to compare our problem in dealing with sentences having both a descriptive content and an expressive content with Frege's treatment of the relative clause construction. So I'm going to say a few words about this, and then I think I'll skip a bunch of stuff so that this doesn't all get too tedious. But some of you who are interested in this stuff, I'd be happy to chat with you later on. So there's this famous sentence in Frege's famous paper, Sinn und Bedeutung. Napoleon, who recognized the danger to his right flank, personally led his troops against the enemy's position. So here we have a relative clause. And what does Frege say about it? Frege says, this sentence expresses two propositions. It just separately expresses two propositions. It doesn't express a conjunctive proposition in the way in which Napoleon both recognized the danger to his right flank and led his troops against the enemy position, right? That you might say is a conjunction, or it has a conjunctive predicate. This, Napoleon, comma, who, relative clause, close comma. It's a non-restrictive relative clause. That's probably important. That's important. So Frege says there are two propositions expressed. One of them, Napoleon recognized the danger to his right flank. That's what's in the non-restrictive relative clause. The other, Napoleon personally led his troops against the enemy's position. Now, Frege goes on to say that the truth condition for the sentence with the non-restrictive relative clause in it is this: the original sentence is true if and only if both of the two propositions are true. And if either of them is false, then the original sentence is false. So there's two claims that Frege is making here. One, that the sentence expresses two propositions. And secondly, he proposes a way of resolving the vexed question of truth. That is, you got a sentence with two propositions. There's four cases: true, 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 false, false, true, false, false, right? Which of these cases should we say that the original sentence is true? How should we deal with that? And he says the answer is take the conjunction of the two sentences. Now, there are other cases in which sentences have been seen by important figures to express more than one proposition. For example, in the theory of descriptions, Russell's theory of descriptions actually is a classical case. If we say that the author of Waverley is Scottish, both the proposition that there's one and only one author of Waverley is expressed, and also the proposition that a certain person is Scottish is expressed. Now, Russell's view was, rather like Frege's here, almost roughly, but not precisely, that it's the conjunction of the two propositions that we should use in order to determine the truth of a sentence like this. But other authors, Strawson, for example, says no, one of these propositions should be regarded as a presupposition, and the other proposition should be regarded as what's asserted, and if the presupposition is false, then the sentence has no truth value, and if the presupposition is true, then the sentence has the truth value of the other one. So Strawson has a different way of resolving what I call the vexed question of truth in this two proposition case from the way in which Russell resolves it and from the way in which Frege resolves his situation. So I think it's this phenomenon about a single sentence involving more than one proposition, not all of which may be asserted, perhaps, as part of what's said when the sentence is used that causes the application of the notion of truth to often be more uncertain than the application of the notion of validity. Much of the literature on pejoratives recognizes that sentences like "that damn Kaplan was promoted" have two contents, something like what is said, which I call descriptive content, and something like what is expressed or displayed, which I call expressive content. However, because most of these authors focus on the vexed question of truth rather than on semantic information, their emphasis is often on an unpersuasive general account of how expressive content figures into truth. Now I want to talk about the deviance in these logics. Before I leave "that damn Kaplan was promoted," I want to say a few more things about it. There are some interesting features of the logic of expressives that show that something more than mere description is going on. As I said, I thought that argument number one, "that damn Kaplan was promoted, therefore Kaplan was promoted," is valid. On the other hand, the corresponding conditional, "if that damn Kaplan was promoted, then Kaplan was promoted," simply is not a logical truth. And the same for either "that damn Kaplan was promoted," or it's not the case that "that damn Kaplan was promoted." So compare, either Kaplan is a honky or he isn't, right? I mean, is that just a logical truth? It can't be a logical truth and still have a disparaging content to it. It should be empty in a certain way of both expressive and descriptive content if it's going to be regarded as a logical truth. There's a related phenomenon in the non-restrictive relative clauses that Frege didn't actually notice. So if you took, let's see, Napoleon, who is my uncle, led his troops into battle. If you take the negation, it's not the case that Napoleon, who is my uncle, led his troops into battle. You're not actually negating the conjunction of the two. What you're doing is you're negating that Napoleon led his troops into battle, and you've still got the other proposition that Napoleon is my uncle, or Napoleon recognized the threat on his right, and so on. Somehow, the non-restrictive relative clause sort of pops out of the sentence when you embed the sentence in a larger sentence. I mean, make it an antecedent of a conditional or put a negation in front of it, and still sits there as a separate proposition. So Frege's idea that the truth condition is to take the conjunction of the two, you have to keep tracking what conjunction you're going to take. When you negate the whole thing, you're not negating the conjunction, you're negating something else. Anyway, there's a deviant logic that shows up in almost all of these in these cases. The deviant logic is a question of compositionality. That is, how do we compute the expressive content of a compound expression, you know, a negation or a conjunction of two expressions or a generalization on an expression, from how do we compute the descriptive and expressive content of the compound from the descriptive and expressive content of the parts? And as I say, it comes out to be a little deviant in almost all of these cases. Now, not all expressives do combine with other expressions to form compounds. Goodbye and hello don't really, but many do. Damn, honky, and so on. And interestingly, among those that do are certain indexicals. For example, you know, there's a whole stack of first-person pronouns in Japanese, just as one might imagine, depending on whether you're speaking with your peer. There's a first-person pronoun that only the emperor is allowed to use. There's a first-person pronoun that you use when you're talking to your peers. There's a first-person pronoun that you're using when you're talking to bank officials, you know, and so on. And we're all familiar with the two forms of second-person pronouns in French and German, one of which expresses familiarity and so on. So there's expressive content all around us, actually, if you think about it, and it's stable and conventionalized. Okay, so let me skip over that and turn to ouch. So now, consider the case of ouch. In English, we have the interjection ouch, and we have the sentence I'm in pain. As noted, expressives tend to display something about the speaker. Hence, if the object language contains indexicals and is sufficiently rich, it will often be the case that there's a way of saying descriptively what is only displayed by the expressive. So in the case of ouch, we have ouch and I am in pain. Now, the connection between these two is actually quite famous and controversial, and I plan to join the controversy. There are those who have said that ouch means I am in pain, but Wittgenstein said I am in pain means ouch, which is really quite shocking. I have the quote. So before I do this, I'll want to get to oops, so let me say a little bit more about the general situation regarding both ouch and oops. They're importantly different. Yeah. So here I kind of wave my hands at developing a sort of model theory for this stuff. That's a rather technical, mathematical kind of development as to how a formal language would be developed. What we would need to know about any expressive in the language is what must be the case in order for the expressive to be expressively correct. Right, so for it to be expressively correct is for its expressive content to hold, right? So this is where the rules of use come in, right? And okay, so I take it that the rule for ouch is reasonably simple, that the speaker has just experienced probably a sudden and sharp pain. I'm not going to worry too much about giving exact how precise the analysis is. There's a lot that one could say on this. I want to get a rough cut at it. Ouch does not combine with other expressions to form complex sentences, but some expressives do, as noted. So we'll need rules to compute the expressive content of complex expressions from their parts. And the point of this preceding discussion about logical deviance is that these rules may not be obvious. And a deviant that is the way in which, for example, if you had a sentence with expressive content and you take its negation, the expressive content of the resulting sentence may not be sort of the complement of the expressive content of the original sentence. In fact, it isn't, right? So the rules are not going to be kind of simple Boolean rules in the way that one might hope them to be. So now, to return to semantic information, we can understand a kind of model theoretic framework as representing such information by looking at the context of use in which the given expression would be correctly used, that is, in which it would be expressively correct. So my claim, which is a soft and an old one, is that we get a useful way of representing the information in a descriptive sentence simply by looking at all the contexts at which the sentence would be descriptively correct. And this has been invaluable in developing traditional logics. And the new idea is that we can get an equally useful measure of the expressive information that is in a sentence by looking at all the contexts at which the sentence containing the expressive, is expressively correct. So we have descriptives, descriptively correct, descriptive content, expressives, expressive content, expressively correct. Now we can return to ouch and I am in pain. Now I claim that ouch is an expressive that is used to express the content that the agent is in pain. So what is the semantic information on this kind of model theoretic analysis, if it is that? The semantic information in the word ouch is represented by the set of those contexts at which the word ouch is expressively correct, namely the set of those contexts at which the agent is in pain. That set of context represents the semantic information contained in the word ouch. What's the information that is in the sentence, I am in pain? Now, this is a descriptive sentence, entirely descriptive, and the information in that sentence is the set of all contexts at which the sentence is descriptively correct, namely true, and that again is the set of all contexts at which the agent is in pain. So by this representation of semantic information, the semantic information in ouch is exactly the same as the semantic information in I am in pain. Now, mind you, I'm not saying, therefore, that there is no linguistic difference between ouch and I am in pain. The former is a single word, an interjection, and expressive. It lacks a truth value and does not syntactically combine with other expressions in ways in which sentences do. The latter, the sentence I am in pain, is a sentence, it has a truth value, and it does combine in all the old familiar ways with negation and conditionalization and so on. But at least according to the present representation, the information, the semantic information in ouch is identical with the semantic information in I am in pain. So we may come to the conclusion that ouch and I am in pain are, oh, and I didn't get to write this on the board, but my term is informationally equivalent. That's what I want to say about them. They are informationally equivalent. Now, some may conclude that this is a reductio ad absurdum of this way of representing the information, but I myself find it in accord with intuition. On this analysis, the linguistic differences between the interjection and the sentence seem more syntactical than semantical. The information they convey is the same, but they convey it through different modes of expression. Note, however, the following, that differing hierarchies of tropes are generated by the two expressions. There is, for example, and this is fairly common across the expressives, there is, for example, the empathetic use of ouch when we see another person hurt. You know, you see somebody drop something on their toe, and you say, ouch. It's kind of empathetically speaking for the person. I know of no corresponding empathetic use of I am in pain. Now, this may suggest that there are other important differences between the two modes of expression, differences not captured by the model theoretic representation, and probably there are. I hope that these differences need not be the concern of logic, which is grounded more in the literal use of language than in things like an empathetic use. But I thought the empathetic use was very interesting in showing that even though the information is the same, there's something about the structure of the expressive that allows this kind of transformation, whereas the purely scientific descriptive statement just doesn't allow for it. Please note that it is the semantic information in the expressions that we're talking about, not something that can be derived from the fact that someone has uttered such an expression. From the fact that someone has uttered I am in pain, we can conclude that the utterer has mastered a certain portion of English, but that isn't part of the semantic information in the sentence I am in pain. Now, if I'm correct, it's easy to see why somebody might mistake the simple semantic fact, the informational equivalence of the two expressions, for some kind of profound epistemological insight into the functioning of language and come to the conclusion, a conclusion that to me is simply perverse, that the sentence I am in pain is actually synonymous with the word ouch, and that since ouch is so plainly inexpressive, I am in pain must likewise be inexpressive and must therefore attribute no property to any subject. So I'm being a bit unfair here to Wittgenstein, but it seems like a good thing to do. He gets lots of praise. I'm going to come back to this, but first I want to turn to oops. One little side comment. There have been many pronouncements about particular uses of expressives all the way from Wittgenstein on pain to Stevenson on good. And all of this has been done without any general framework within which to try to assess these things. And that's one of the things that I'm aiming to do, to give a kind of general framework in which we can talk in a scientific way about, ethnic slur terms and all the rest of this stuff, and ultimately try, maybe we could help to answer some of these issues about emotivism and so on, within that framework. So oops is very interesting and importantly different from ouch, as I'm sure you're aware. So I take it that oops is an expressive and that it expresses the fact that the agent has just observed a minor mishap. So in the present terminology, oops has the expressive content, I have just observed a minor mishap. It's expressively correct, just in case I have observed a minor mishap, but as I've said, expressives, just like any other parts of language, can be used insincerely. You can pretend, in other words, using them. So here again we have informational equivalence between an expressive interjection and a purely descriptive sentence. Again, I beg your forbearance regarding smaller perfections of my analysis of the expressive content of oops, since, as is obvious, the merit of the analyses I propose does not depend on whether they apply exactly to the examples I've chosen, but rather on whether English could contain expressions that conform to my analysis, and on whether the tools of analysis are of value in thinking about philosophical issues of meaning. So I'm a theoretician of language, not an experimentalist. So allow me, I have just observed a minor mishap for oops. Now I want you to think about the following situation. Actually, I wrote this when we were in Scandinavia. So you're in a glassware store, and there's a small pyramid of glasses set up on a table, say a dozen glasses in a little pyramid on display. And you observe someone walk down the aisle, bump into the pyramid, causing it to collapse and causing all the glasses to break. And as an observer, you say, oops. Completely appropriate, it seems. You have just become aware of a minor mishap. Now notice that if the bump had caused the whole building to collapse, killing hundreds of people, you wouldn't have said, oops, unless by characterizing the disaster as a minor mishap, you are intending a macabre joke. An utterance of oops in the face of a true disaster is expressively incorrect. The main point I want to make at this stage of the discussion is that for oops to be expressively correct, the observed event must be correctly characterized as a minor mishap. Now note on the side that if you had said oops when the building collapsed, in spite of the incorrectness and even the vileness of your speech act, I would understand it. I would get what you were doing. Namely, making a macabre joke by playing on the literal meaning of oops. So you might have thought initially, does oops have a meaning? Does it have a literal meaning? Can you play on the literal meaning in order to produce something else? All that seems to fall into place in a rather smooth way. Another nice case that my colleague Shauna Schifrin called to my attention, in which one manipulates the literal meaning of the word oops to achieve a social purpose, concerns my saying oops when my guest has caused, in fact, a not-so-minor mishap, right? I mean, in fact, it was the valuable glass heirloom that was knocked off the table and smashed into 1,000 pieces. And I say, oops, making as if it were a minor mishap, right? In this case, the reasons are dictated by social practices of blame taking and blame placing and so on. What I'm trying to show here is that my analysis of the literal meaning of oops, it's a use thing, of course, it's not a meaning with a capital M, can be used to explain various other uses of the expression, some that aren't literal, and this I take to provide indirect support for the analysis of what I take to be the literal meaning. So let me continue the original story of the broken glasses, putting aside the fantastic alternative in which the building collapses. You saw this person bump into the pyramid, the glass broke, and you said, oops. They sweep away the broken glass and build the pyramid again. And the person who bumped into it backs away and waits a little while and then walks down the aisle again on exactly the same path, bumps again, and the glasses come down again. Now, you can't figure out what's going on. They sweep up the glass, rebuild the pyramid for a second time, and the same person walks around, down the aisle, bumps into the pyramid, and again, the glasses come down. Now, we in Los Angeles would quickly recognize that they're making a movie, and the man, who's an actor, is supposed to bump into the glasses and knock them down and break them, and we can imagine a continuation of the story in which, for the fourth time, he bumps into the pyramid, but this time the glasses shake, but they don't fall down, and the actor stops and says, "Oops." Now, here we have a case in which you, the speaker, sincerely thought that you were observing a minor mishap. You thought it was a minor mishap, but it wasn't. It wasn't a mishap at all. It was something that was done deliberately. It was done intentionally. You were sincere, but mistaken in the thought that you expressed. Although it's perfectly understandable how you made that mistake, still, what you expressed, that you had just observed a minor mishap, was incorrect. Now, the moral of this story, in contrast to that of Ouch, is that in this case, you, the oopser, do not have privileged access to the state of affairs which must obtain in order for the expressive to be expressively correct. In saying oops, you made an error. I'm inclined to call it a factual error. You didn't make an error by saying something false, because oops isn't a sentence, so I wouldn't say it's true or false. It does, however, contain semantic information. The semantic information was that you had just observed a minor mishap, but you had not just observed a minor mishap. Given that your exclamation was sincere, you made an erroneous judgment. Okay, so here's the important thing. Here we've got a classical expressive, and what's expressed is not something attitudinal at all. It's something factual. I call expressives that express no more than a state of the speaker, a state of the speaker, let's say, subjective, and I call expressives that express more than that, objective. This is a very rough. Ouch is a subjective expression. It expresses something about the state of the speaker. Oops is an object of one. It expresses something about the nature of the external world. It may be that when we're in pain, we have privileged access to that fact and cannot fail to know that we're in pain, but when we believe we've observed a minor mishap, we certainly do not have privileged access to that fact, to whether what we observed is minor or not, and even to whether it was a mishap or something done intentionally. So an expressive can express a state to which the utterer does not have any special access. More importantly, and this is the main lesson of oops, an expressive can express a state that isn't attitudinal at all. I wish to note briefly that the subjective-objective distinction among expressives does not really articulate with any special epistemological distinction, and I could have defined it in a way that made it closer to some epistemological distinction, but it's better to keep your distance. There's an interesting issue regarding honorific and derogatory expression. You know, honorifics like sir, your honor, the honorable, so and so and so on, and derogatory expressions like, well, you all know the derogatory expressions that can be put using this terminology. Question is this: when we use derogatory titles, say, and honorific titles, say, does the honorific express the speaker's respect or the subject's respectability, that is, worthiness of respect? So you have to ask yourself, what do we want to take as the expressive content of the honorifics and the derogatory things? Do you want to take it to express something about the attitude of the speaker, or do you want it, which would be subjective as I roughly divide it, or something objective, something about the worthiness of respect, say, of the figure being addressed, or the worthiness of disdain, right, of the subject being addressed. The fact that rationality commands us to bring these two into line, that is, to respect those and only those who merit it, makes it more difficult to mount a decisive case. Still, I'm inclined to believe that the correct semantics for these expressives is subjective. Now, this may make me sound like an emotivist of the old style, but I'm nothing like that. I regard worthiness of respect as a perfectly acceptable objective notion, not to be reduced to some subjective notion, and I don't regard good as an expressive. I've written stuff about this, and I'm wondering, maybe I'll just read one little bit here. To me, there's evaluating, which is aiming at the outside. This is an activity that all academics engage in constantly, right? And then there's something that's more subjective, which is, one might call it approving or preferring, right? And these seem to me to be dramatically different. The early emotivists sometimes characterize their own theory as the boo hurrah theory. Now, here's a couple more of those interjections with a lot of expressive content. Now, the paradigm setting for those interjections is the sports field, in which such expressions of approval and rejection are de rigueur. If you have never booed what you know to be the better team, or cheered for what you know to be the worse, you're not a sports fan. Or you're in full denial, as many sports fans are, right? So when you boo, when you say boo or say hurrah, I think what you're expressing is approval and whatever the opposite of that is. I don't think you're saying I don't think you're saying something objective, that the team is worthy of approval. I don't think you're making that kind of evaluative remark. I think you're simply expressing something subjective. At any rate, a boo and hurrah, I think, are characteristic subjective expressions, and it seems very odd to think that something like that could substitute for evaluatives. At any rate, I think the linguistic relationship between oops and I have just observed a minor mishap is exactly the same as that between ouch and I'm in pain. They're informationally equivalent. They're not logically equivalent because you can't derive oops and you can't derive ouch. Syntax alone blocks that move because neither is a sentence. One shouldn't get confused about that, but by the same token, one shouldn't get confused by the syntax and deny the fact that they're informationally equivalent. Now, I want to jump over to good. So now the topic is non-translational meta-language. Having undertaken the analysis of some particular expressions for which rules of use provide the semantical information they carry, I want to call attention to a feature of my own earlier work on indexicals that I feel I did not sufficiently stress. And it's this, that the meta-language in which the semantics is given for an object language containing indexicals is non-translational. That is, we use no indexicals, and we need use no indexicals in describing the semantics of a language that contains indexicals. Remember I said there's this, for the first person pronoun, for example, there's that simple good rule, right? The correct use of the first person pronoun is to refer to the individual who's using it, right? I don't have to use any indexicals. I don't have to refer to myself in order to explain that rule. That's a rule that could be explained in, a purely scientific language. So the meta-language in which we describe the rules of use for the language containing indexicals doesn't have a translation in it for the indexicals. Now, this is actually a rather surprising fact, if you think about it, since many say that what has to be done in providing a semantic theory is to give a translational theory. That is, an adequate semantic theory must allow you to derive or in some way obtain all sentences of the form S is true if and only if P, where S is a sentence of the object language and P is its translation into the meta language. Now, how are you going to do that if the object language contains indexicals, but the meta language doesn't? You can't. You're going to have to come up with some other mechanism whereby the semantics is given. And it's here that the distinction between terms like fortnight and feral and those like goodbye and the indexicals has bite. When we move to epithets and derogatory terms and expressives, it's even more obvious that it must be possible to describe the semantics of swear words without swearing, of obscene words without becoming obscene, and of derogatory words without insulting anybody. We shouldn't have to have ethnic slur terms in our semantic meta language in order to be able to describe how what the use is of ethnic slur terms in the object language, right? It seems obvious when you think about it, but it's a little surprising against the background tradition that the job of semantics is to provide these translational things. Okay. For example, for the first person pronoun, we would say that it's used by a speaker to refer to him or herself. Compare this to how you would describe the use of fortnight. You might say, to refer to a period of 14 days, right? There you need a translation in order to explain what's going on. But in the case of the indexicals, you don't need a translation of the indexical. So the task for a semantic theory is to give us some scientific description of the semantics of the object language, not to reproduce it, not to give synonyms, not to provide equivalent means of expression, but to describe it from above. And this we certainly can do for indexicals, and we can do it without referring to ourselves or where we are or what day it is and so on in the way we would if we were using indexicals. We should be able to use as our semantical meta-language what Quine called the austere language of science, a language without indexicals, tense, epithets, euphemisms, and so on. We have here a kind of application of Carnap's principle of tolerance, one form of which was allow any form of object language, but keep the meta language clean, right? Clean and simple. But whereas the availability of a translation of object language expressions into the meta language is at least useful for classical object languages, it seems useless for the expressions here under consideration. This suggests that the semantic relation between these expressions and the rules of use that give the semantic information they carry is in some fundamental way different from the semantic relation as we have conceived it between words like feral and fortnight and the semantic information they carry. This is the heart of my claim that there's a real difference between rules of use and rules of meaning. Now, let's see, I'm going to try to see if I can, let's see how much time I have. Just a few minutes. So let me skip over that. There's a lot of interesting stuff about respect and the use of honorifics. I'll skip it, though. And I'll skip that. I'll skip this. I mean, there was a lot of stuff on. The question is, could we eliminate expressives? I mean, why do we need expressives? Do we need expressives, right? There's a similar, very interesting question. Can we eliminate indexicals from our language, right? Do you need indexicals? I mean, why not name things and just use names? What do you need indexicals for? And there's a lot of interesting things that one could say. I've tried to write a little bit about that subject as to the sense in which you could eliminate them, the sense in which you really can't eliminate them, and so there's a lot of epistemology that comes into it. And there's other interesting things about expressives and the role that expressives play in displaying attitudes as opposed to averring that one has an attitude. Respect is one of those things that people want to see displayed. People want to be respected, but they also want respectful behavior, right, independent of whether the respectful behavior is sincere or not. You know, in the Army, they tell you, oh, you're saluting the uniform, you're not saluting the person. That means you can make a sign of respect by saluting, even though you don't respect the person you're saluting. So this is typical Army talk, you know, oh, it's the uniform you respect. Okay, so it's an insincere form of respect to salute when you don't really respect the person that you're saluting, but people like respectful behavior, right? And honorifics may be the coin of respectful behavior. So there's a series of interesting arguments as to why the expressions which carry information expressively, rather than just saying, oh, I respect you. I respect you and I'll always respect you. I'll respect you in the morning and so on, you know, don't work in the way in which certain behaviors that display respect. I mean, don't just tell me you love me, you know, show it. Show me, as it says in the song, right? Okay, so I want to move toward the end to goodbye. So I've taken goodbye as a paradigm of expressions requiring a semantics of use. It's also a paradigm of useful expressions that do not seem to represent anything, thereby challenging the widely held view that language is a system of representations. And for these reasons, it's important to my project to be able to give a correct analysis of goodbye within the framework of my central notions, semantic information, mode of expression, and the correlative notions of expressive content and expressive correctness. All this along with a resulting notion of sincere use. Because remember I said every form of language you should be able to lie with. So here it isn't quite lying, but there should be insincere ways of using these forms of language which carry information. So here's a problem that I initially found very puzzling. I thought to myself, if the analysis is right, then there ought to be insincere uses of goodbye. So I thought, okay, so what would be an insincere use of goodbye? It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy, okay? But then when I started to go back and say, well, let's look at what the expressive content is and let's try to find a situation in which the person does not believe true the expressive content, I immediately thought of the case in which I drop you off at the door of your surprise party and I say goodbye, insincerely planning to park and quickly run around and join the party. Now, I take it that the expressive, in this case, the word goodbye, has as its expressive content something like, you and I are now parting from one another for a significant period of time. Probably it doesn't any longer contain the elements of well-wishing, you know, that are in the etymology of goodbye is from God be with you, and probably well-wishing isn't any part of the expressive content any longer, because I think nowadays if someone said goodbye and plainly did not wish the person well, you wouldn't think that was an insincere use of goodbye, right? Goodbye seems perfectly acceptable to be used in that situation. Okay, so that's the expressive content. Insincerity is always the failure to believe that the expression used is informationally correct, right? That it's always the failure to believe true what the expressive content is or what the descriptive content is. That's what insincerity is, right? So that gives us a use of goodbye in which a person does not believe that they're really parting for a significant period of time, and then you quickly think of the surprise party kind of situation. So the notion of expressive content, for me, the generation of insincere uses of goodbye, again, sort of helped me to partially confirm this approach to the subject. The notion of expressive content can also be used to restore confidence in the view that language is a system of representations, for we can regard expressives as representing their information content, though not, of course, in the descriptive mode. As in all other cases, the semantic information could be expressed in another mode. That's a central idea of my project. Thus, I regard goodbye and you and I are now parting from one another as informationally equivalent. So now the conclusions. So the distinctions I've tried to make between descriptives and expressives, between descriptive content and expressive content, is not that between characterizations of the world and expressions of emotion, an echo of the old distinction between cognitive and emotive meaning. The mode of expression, descriptive versus expressive, does not correlate with the nature of the semantic information, objective versus subjective. The distinction doesn't correlate with whether it's about me or whether it's about the external world. That's part of the lesson of OOPS. In OOPS, the information is objective, but the word is an expressive. Similarly, the information in I am in a state of joyful elation is presented in a descriptive mode, although the semantic information itself is as subjective as can be, and perhaps the very same semantic information is contained in the expressive hooray. Ouch and I'm in pain were given as an analogous pair. I recognize that more detailed argument may be required to account for differences in our responses to expressions that I regard as informationally equivalent, and thus to build the case for my central notion of semantic information. In fact, one of the interesting topics that I did skip over was that we do respond differently to the way in which the information is carried. A part of the stuff that I felt badly to skip over is a contrast between editorial cartoons and the way we respond to them and the way that we respond to discursive editorials. The cartoons have a lot more punch, even though what they say somehow is the same as something that can be said in another way, but our response is different. And I have hypotheses that has to do with evolutionary kinds of things. At any rate, part of such an argument involves getting clear on the fact that to the degree that information is encoded semantically, to that degree there exists the possibility of insincere use. For some obscure reason, when people think about expressives, they forget about the craft of actors and imagine that utterances of ouch, oops, and hooray and the like are generated by the autonomic nervous system. If such utterances were generated by the autonomic nervous system and could not be consciously simulated, they would carry no semantic information, for they'd not be part of any system of conventional representation that constitutes language. So here are the morals. First, it seems to be quite possible to extend semantic methods, even formal model theoretic semantics, to a range of expressions that have been regarded as falling outside semantics and perhaps even as being insusceptible to formalization. This allows those of us of a logical turn of mind, those of us who think of language as a formal system, to use our familiar techniques. For me, it's illuminating to do so. I think it allows us to see more clearly the relationship between expressives and descriptives, and especially expressions of mixed kind, like these, mixing in ethnic slur terms and ordinary kinds of sentences, and to treat expressives in a serious scientific way. In so doing, we see that there is indeed a technical distinction between a semantics of use and the traditional semantics of meaning. Second moral, by clarifying the relation between speaker intention and linguistic convention, this is stuff that was in an unread part of the paper. I'll skip over that moral. Third, in acknowledging that had to do with linguistic convention versus other kinds of conventions that govern the use of language. I call them social practices, but just because I need two different words. So, for example, many of you may not know, but one is not allowed to ask a question of the Queen. So when you're in the receiving, probably most of you have not been in a receiving line with the Queen. You probably have, right? But when you meet the Queen, you can say, nice day, your hat's on funny, but you can't say, who does your hair, right? Okay, so there's two kinds, I mean, not asking a question of the Queen is a convention, and it governs linguistic use, right? But we need to somehow get a line between these two different kinds of conventions, and there's a long section on that. So in acknowledging the conventionalized significance of the expressive side of language, the concept of semantic information may turn out to be useful in combating the excesses of those who feel that there's no limit to the amount of ideology and belief that is embedded in the words and phrases of our language. Surely, this latter view is a counsel of despair that threatens the very concept of precise communication between parties in disagreements. It's one thing to enlarge our view of meaning. It's another to give way to metaphysical monism. Fourth and last, as a philosophical bonus, I hope that my analysis will help us to see that although there may be profound epistemological insights that relate to the connection between the descriptive I am in pain and the expressive ouch, there is also a purely semantical explanation of the connection, an explanation that makes it exactly analogous to the connection between oops and I have observed a minor mishap, a case that is free of epistemological considerations. And here, I continue my long-term project of trying to unmask semantical truths in epistemological clothing. Thanks.